What's that?
You're being recorded right
We might just.
now.
I mean, for anyone else who comes, yeah, make like maybe 4 or 5 more.
You're famous now.
We're on? Okay. I'll stall them as long as I can, though. Don't miss it. All right, let's do just a quick summary of where we're holding here. So the mimer starts with the question of why is Vadodi Li inside of the word Elul, when, according to the Alter Rebbe, it really represents what happens in Rosh Hashanah, right? So we start to explain that it's even sort of a further question on this same point, which is that the intention of the mashal of the king in the field is in order to be a mashal to explain to us the Ani Vadodi part. Because we're saying that there's no arousal from Hashem, which would then make you do the service, but rather there's just an empowerment, which essentially empowers you to do it, but you're doing it yourself. This is the whole idea of Elul. No one's going to make you do it. The king being in the field is that the king is dressed down, is not giving you a tremendous level of inspiration over the top, and essentially anyone who wants to can go out and see him, but no one's forcing you to, right? This is what the whole idea is. So we said, but then we have a problem. What's the problem? In the very mashal itself, guys, I'm getting confused here. There's a lot going on in here. David, you good with that? Is that for this class?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get organized. So we said, what's the problem with the mashal? The Alter Rebbe seemingly goes too far, which is that in the mashal, it could have ended by the king being in the field. Because that's enough for me to be aroused to... That's enough. It's pretty distracting. I don't know why I'm so distracted, but it's a lot of noise and distraction. That's okay. Okay, L'chaim, let's get back on the ball here. You have a copy of the mimer? Okay, there's nothing I can do for you. No, I'm saying he's getting copies. Fine. So the mashal, where does the mashal fall short? Is that it goes too far, right? If it was just said the king is in the field and he's dressed down, and therefore it's a mashal for days of Elul being weekdays as opposed to having the intense power of Yom Kippur. When the 13 attributes are shining, it's usually the intensity of Yom Kippur. In Elul, the 13 attributes are shining, but it's just a simple weekday. This is what the mashal comes to explain. The king is dressed down, he's in the field, he's not there to arouse you, he's just there to empower you. Anyone who wants to can go out and be inspired, but you have to do it yourself. Right? Shmuel, welcome back, because you missed yesterday. We're back to your original question, though, which was, in the mashal, why does it say the king is going to receive him with this friendly face and show him this laughing face and give him all this revelation? That seems to have crossed the line of where the mashal of Elul is useful anymore. Because now it comes out that the person who's seeing the king is having a revelation come his way, right? Full-blown revelation in 2 levels. We started to explain that there's 2 different levels of pleasure that are being released from the king, right? One level is the pleasure of what's called a compound pleasure, which is the idea of the king who receives him, meaning to say he receives him because he produces some good works for the king, right? What is the king receiving? He's receiving your approach to him, which is your offering of your will, of fulfilling his will of Torah mitzvahs, right? So the first face of the king, we said, is like a compound pleasure. When you derive pleasure from another thing, right? It's called a pleasure hamurkav, which is it's like a compound pleasure. And then the king goes further and shows you this laughing face. We said, where does laughter come from? Laughter comes from a place which was beyond intellect. It's like the essential pleasure of the king, that it's not based on what you're giving him. It's not a conditional compound pleasure based on unlocking it from some gift, but rather what he said, it's the essential pleasure of the king. Why is the essential pleasure of the king suddenly shining through? Who remembers? What's he so excited about? What does the king derive his essential pleasure from? Not what you give him, and not even your tshuva, but you, right? That the fact that you did tshuva and the king accepts this tshuva, shows you that the king has an intrinsic desire for you, whether or not you do something for him or not. He just essentially loves you for no reason. So that's what's called an infinite pleasure, which is associated with laughter, sort of breaks the barriers of intellect and so forth. And this is then even shown to you. Where are we going with this? All this revelation of pleasure coming your way from the king, which is the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, that sounds like a full-blown revelation, right? So we tried to use your explanation yesterday. In your absence, we used your svara, but we're still going to be trying to undo it, which was that maybe you could say that this is all still a nasinas koach. You know, the fact that the king is revealing all this pleasure to you, you're just sitting on your couch getting more and more empowered by the fact that not only can I go see the king, but if I go see the king, he's going to reveal one level of pleasure, then he's going to reveal a second level of pleasure. So all this is then actually just amplifying my will to go see him. I can still say it's an ani ladodi. That's actually how we explained it yesterday. But the truth is, we're going to go back to our original difficulty with this. These are things that you could actually experience in Elul. That's the problem. If it was just a matter of being an empowerment, then I wouldn't actually have access to all these unbelievable levels of divine pleasure in this month. At the end of the day, there is a revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, right? And that is called a revelation of light. And we're now coming to be taught what that revelation is. It's a revelation of pleasure, different levels of pleasure, all the way up to the level of the essential pleasure of God. It's going to be shining from me because of my very existence. These are not just empowerments. It's not just a theory. What's the proof? Go and try and do the avoda, and you can experience these levels of pleasure. And not only can you experience them, we said every single person can experience them, even more so than the allotted amount in Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because the king is dafka shining these people to the lowest factor of our populace, right? He wants those people who are sinners in the simplest level to also be offered this level of pleasure. And therefore, on one hand, we answered a question, which is like, why is the V'dodi li inside of Elul? Well, it's very clear why it's inside of Elul, because there's a major revelation of God inside of Elul, that my beloved is to me. What we haven't really understood is, why is this considered Ani Ladodi month? Right? Because we're back to the original question, which is the whole idea of the month of Elul was supposed to be that I do all the work and I'm merely empowered. It definitely comes out seeming from this, and the Rebbe is going to double down and basically say this outright in today's lecture, that this is a full-blown arousal, in fact. Like there's these levels of pleasure from God. You don't want this one, it's the wrong one. These levels of pleasure from God are, in fact, moving us to be inspired, right? It's undoubtedly. And therefore, how are we really calling this an Ani Ladodi experience? Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, I think the most important thing you said there was go and do the Vaida and then you'll find out what it is.
But still, if I'm going to find out what it is, there's going to be that reward to my reciprocation to my avoda. In Elul, you've already sort of changed the course of what we thought the Alter Rebbe was saying, which is that the revelation comes later. Right? We're understanding that now the revelation comes in this month. There is a king in the field, and he's shining to everybody. And he's shining you these faces, which is really divine pleasure. Right? So we've answered one question, and we got stuck on another one. We answered the question why V'dodi li is in Elul, the Ani Ladodi V'dodi li. What we haven't understood is why the Alter Rebbe is trying to make this claim that Elul is Ani Ladodi month, right? That it's all about our service, and the reward comes only in Rosh Hashanah.
You have to use it when you have to say that, because it says in the first four letters of Alter Rebbe's Maimer, it's Ani Ladodi Rosh Hashanah Elul. Clearly the Alter Rebbe knew that Ani Ladodi and Ladodi was what going to be in Elul also.
Clearly the Alter Rebbe knows everything about everybody and everyone, every angel, every soul, every letter. But the question is, what does he mean, right? How do we understand the Alter Rebbe? So now the Rebbe is explaining, right, that first of all, there is a revelation in this month. And in fact, that's what the Alter Rebbe goes on to say in his own Maimer, that the king is shining faces of pleasure to you right now in this month. So then now we have a question on the Alter Rebbe. There's no question that he is indicating that. Our question now, which also he'll have been indicating until we realize why is this nonetheless called the service of my initiative, right? And that's where we're taking, yeah.
Just with that word more compound, is it initially the compounded thing because it's partly you and partly the king, and then when it's uncompounded, it's because it
Yeah, I didn't explain it too well today. Yesterday we gave a better explanation. But essentially, when you derive pleasure from something, how does this work? In like Spheros land, right? You go from like, let's say, Kesser, and Panemius Kesser, which is total pleasure, right? It's just like this nerve ending of pleasure. And then what happens is God takes this energy and this divine light and he cloaks it, which the essential pleasure is God, right? Oz v'chedva b'mkomo, like in his place is the strength and joy. God is just like joy, right? The Ori and Sof, don't think of it as just merely light, which is almost like an inanimate object. It's ultimate pleasure. And it's essentially flowing through everything, and it is everything. The only thing is, when God created the world, he hid himself. Where did he hide himself? In the other spheros. So first of all, he created intelligence. So now instead of experiencing pleasure, you're experiencing intelligence. And then you go lower, you experience emotions, etc., etc. Inside of those emotions, there is if you experience the emotion, you experience a pleasure. That's why some people, you find oftentimes people will get stuck into negative emotions, right? But they know it's bad for them because there's a pleasure there. So they're going to have this emotion because from that negative emotion, they're going to extract the pleasure. Now you could be a healthy, side of things, and you can go and extract the pleasure from eating, celery and spinach. But fine. But so you're going to extract the pleasure from the emotions. Then you can extract the pleasure from intelligence. It's even a higher level of pleasure, right? So when you have like a geschmack idea, the pleasure was hiding underneath and inside of some idea. When you crack open the idea, you release the pleasure. Those are called compound pleasures. They're pleasures which are derived from another thing. Whereas when you get to the ultimate pleasure of the king himself, where he shows you his true laughing face, this is just the essence of pleasure, which is not cloaked in another thing. It's not because of something. You don't get to. So this is God's pleasure in us because we do Torah mitzvahs, or even tshuva at the highest level, or just God's pure pleasure in us for no reason, that he just intrinsically likes us and it doesn't have a reason. That is his intrinsic pleasure. What's making Hashem so happy all the time? What is his essential pleasure? Jews. Why? Don't talk about why. This is not a why situation. It hasn't been cloaked yet in having to have a reason, right? And so when that gets shown to you, you're just essentially beloved by God. Guess what that does to you? It makes you want to serve Hashem. So on one level, it definitely serves the empowerment for it, because nothing would empower you more than realizing that God's essential pleasure is just in you as you are. Nonetheless, you can't say that that's not an actual revelation, right? And therefore, it's more than just an empowerment. It's an arousal to actually make you do something. And this is where sort of our difficulty lies. You with?
So the real question is, why is it Ani Ladodi and Elosh?
Now we've gotten to the real question, which is, why is it Ani Ladodi? I'm pretty much convinced that I'm being aroused. Now, why are you telling me that has to do with me? Okay? Good. So let's go on to chapter Vav. Sometimes you have to just go into the deep end and see if you can swim. Don't worry. We'll get you some Boker Tov. Okay, so let's go into Os Vav. Tzrich lahavin. We have to understand the mehanal from everything we said above. Move on, it's understood. Here you go. The Rebbe is just going to help us make out the truth here. It's not just an empowerment to do the service. You're not just being encouraged over here. What's that? You could take a photo. Yes, very photogenic. In other words, it's not just an empowerment, but when the king is in the field, an empowerment would be that you have the permission, you have the ability. In other words, that would be the empowerment. That here he is, if you want, go get him. No, it's more than that. This, what we're seeing is that in this mashal, you're clearly being aroused. Right? The fact that the king is going to show you one level of pleasure by being joyful about the gift of coming to him. And particularly, and more than that, he then reveals the ultimate joy, the essential joy in your existence. This actually, Pashut, arouses us to return in perfect tshuva to Hashem. So this paragraph is basically the exactly our summary. And nonetheless, we're left with a question, why is Elul primarily called Ani Ladodi month? And it's all about you, based on everything we just said. So that was our recap of our question. V'yesh lahosif. And we want to add, the Indian zesha gilu de Elul hu lo rak nasinas koach elagam orer. In other words, furthermore on this fact that it's not just an empowerment but a full-blown arousal, we can understand going back even to the very nature of the king being in the field. In other words, at least at this point we were convinced that the king being in the field, at least at baseline level, forgetting about his faces and showing us all this pleasure, we thought, well, the king being in the field, we can at least all agree that that's just an empowerment. That's not an arousal. That's what this whole thing was based on. If the Alter Rebbe would have started the mashal and ended it just by the king being in the field, we could have all agreed that he's only giving us an empowerment. So now the Rebbe is challenging even that basic premise. He says, no, what are you talking about? The king being in the field itself is already an arousal. In addition to the fact that when the king is in the field, each one has the ability and the permission to go and see his face. No one brought this point up, but it's kind of smacking you in the face. The very knowledge, right, of the people that the king is in the field, but also in that very place where they're found, that itself arouses their will. If I told you right now that the Rebbe was rolling into town, in 20 minutes, you're not just going to sit there and think, wow, I'm empowered, if I want to, I can see him. You're going to throw the computer and run. His being in the field is an arousal, right? So he's coming back and challenging the entire principle of everything that this mimer is based on. The very mashal, which was intended to tell us it's all about Ani Ladodi, itself is arousing you to basically get excited. He say footnote 25 for a second, down at the bottom. He says that ubefrat his bonus, particularly this fact that the king is in the field is an arousal, is particularly true when you meditate when you think about why the king is in the field. That his intention to come into the field is is only in order so that you can come see him. And there's the only reason he just sounds like he's just passing through. He came here to see you. And not only did he come here to see you because it was an easy thing for him. In order to come and see you, he had to give up his own greatness of wearing his crown and wearing all of his kingly garb. So in other words, he went through great self-sacrifice of losing his own revelation and his own pleasure, to a certain sense, in order to see you. That very thing is doubling down on the fact that his being in the field is not just an empowerment, but a full-on arousal.
In a way, it's even higher than Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah only the princess could come to him. Here, he's literally leaving to come down to the Kamath.
True, that's exactly right. In a way, it's higher than Rosh Hashanah because there's no self-sacrifice on the part of the king for you on Rosh Hashanah. He's just sort of flying away in Revelations. He'd care less about you. You have to come running after him. Here, it's even more so, right? So now we're just fully confused, right? Even the original mashal of the field is itself an arousal, and a great arousal because of the sacrifice of the king to specifically find himself in your place. That's going to get you moving whether you like it or not. So let's try to understand how this has anything now to do with an Ani Ladodi. Where am I in all this? So the explanation is as follows. The desire to go out and see the king from the standpoint of the people, the reality is, this is not something that needs really to be aroused, because it is your true essential nature. In this line is the answer. How can you call this an Ani Ladodi when every firework is going off in the world to mamish ring your bell and make you do this? Is because when you get down to it, at the end of the day, this is truly your essential desire to go see the king. It's all about Ani Ladodi because that is the real you. This desire comes from your essential nature. The Kevan Shamelech Hu Halev Shel Kol Ha'am. There's this notion that the king is the heart of all the people basically like inside of him, he's like the neshama klalis, and we all are intrinsically bound to him, just like we're almost intrinsically bound to Hashem, who's like our true king. What sort of unites all Jews around the world at some levels is we just like believers, children of believers, there's something inside of this mission, our collective mission, which is held inside of this particular man who just has our heart, right? Because we're all essentially realizing that we're bound up in his cause and in him. L'chein, therefore, your connection with the king is really bound up with your essential nature. It's not something that you have to really derive and contrive and build out of yourself. It is the true you. If you think about it, for example, the way we describe in Chassidus, the concept of the Nasi Hador and the Neshama Klalis, like I just mentioned, is that there is really a person, like it started off with Yaakov Avinu, right, where we say that the word Nasi is an acronym, actually. What's the word? What is the word Nasi an acronym for? Nasi means a prince. We call it the Nasi Adur, like the leader of the generation. Nitzotzo shel Yaakov Avinu, right? The word Nasi is an acronym for the spark of Yaakov Avinu. And what's the idea of the spark of Yaakov Avinu? Yaakov Avinu, it says, had the shufrei. He looked like Adam Arishon. And not only did he look like him physically because they sort of represent the same concept, which is that Adam Arishon had all of humanity inside of him. Anyone who's going to come and be born, they're really just a piece of Avram Avinu, like we've been talking about in the afternoon classes. A son is a piece of the father, right? So everybody in Adam Arishon, he had every single individual soul that was ever going to come out inside of him. So when they come out and they're existing in some separate body, the reality is they're not a separate entity to Adam Arishon. They're just all of a sudden a piece of Adam Arishon which is found over here. Because inside of me had all the souls, right? Okay, it's true that those souls were at the time where they were inside of him, they were not embodied in different places. But just because the souls go and embody them in different places, right? So I could take like a body of water and sort of siphon it out into different cups. It's the same body of water. It's actually one of the reasons why the word mayim is plural. Because no matter where it is, it's like you put two drops of water together. Their nature is to just come back together and become one. It's all the water is really, all the many waters are really one. All the many souls are really one soul. They just found themselves in different places. So this is true about all of humanity. When it came to Yaakov Avinu, who was the source of all the Jewish souls, right? He was inside of Adam. There was basically a section, a Jewish section. And inside of that was all the Jewish souls. And inside of Yaakov, he was the father of all the Jews, right? All the 12 tribes came out of him. Any Jew that's ever going to live is going to be at some level part of Yaakov Avinu's soul. And therefore, every Nasi, right, in his generation, he is that little picture of Yaakov Avinu for the souls of his generation. He's the one person, right, the Rosh B'nai Yisrael. The word Rebbe, by the way, is also an acronym for Rosh B'nai Yisrael. Just like the head of your body contains the instruction manual, and at some level the entire body is contained inside of it, so too in this individual, everybody's contained inside of them. So even when you find yourself to be a leg or a foot or a liver or a toe or even a toenail, the reality is you're a piece of the head. And therefore, you don't have to sort of decide that you want to bind yourself to the head. It is your essential nature. And that's what we mean when we say that the king is the heart of every man in the nation. That his existence is literally our existence, right? And so you have an essential bond with him due to the very nature of your soul. You are actually him at your core level. And when we're saying him, obviously this is just like a sort of a physical manifestation of God. Right? But this unifying force, which everything comes out of, at the end of the day, is God, right? The king of Israel and the leader of Israel is a metaphor for this. That every single entity in existence is not some separate thing that has to decide that it wants to bind itself to the true unity. There's only the true unity. And this true unity sort of shows itself to have been encapsulated in many, many different forms. But if you would look at the essence of any single one of those forms, their essential nature is to be one with the unifying principle. It's just that in Jews this sort of sticks out, right? Because we're connected with Elokus. So too, therefore, who's being aroused? When the king is coming and arousing you and getting you excited to go and join him, he's only reminding you that your essential nature is anyway him. So the whole experience of coming close to the king is always going to be an ani ladodi experience, because that is the real you. You are actually one with the king before he decides to arouse you or not. Just that can be confused and lost on you. So in order to remind you who you really are, he can give you as much arousal as he wants. That arousal is not making you do something. He's just reminding you that's exactly what you wanted to do in the first place. And there we sort of answered the question already, right? The ani ladodi is at the core of the whole situation. Any arousal that you're going to give to this person is not actually arousing him to do something against his will. It's arousing him to remind himself who he actually is to begin with. Someone had some hands up, I saw? Yeah.
So what's like? How would you explain Bibi Netanyahu according to this?
Bibi is, I mean, I think, I don't know, it's hard to say, but at some level, he's like, look, I don't know if, as far as his like place in amongst the people, again, everyone has free choice. So I'm not, you know, I once asked, I was once getting all excited about the Rebbe, which I tend to do. This was like literally 20 years ago. I just came to Sfas and I found myself in this little shul that was like a Tzioni, heavy-duty shul. And I was talking about the Nasi Yadur and the leader. And this guy was like, well, it's whoever the prime minister was at that time. It wasn't Bibi. He's like, it's this guy. I don't want to mention his name. And I was like, are you serious? Like, is that what you think? That this guy is like the head of the Jewish people? I mean, on one hand, he is. Like, we like voted this guy in. He's like our head. But to think that I wouldn't want to put my fate in the hands of this guy. This same guy wound up basically giving away Gush Katif on his watch, which we're now fighting for 20 years later at Mesiras Nefesh. So, but nonetheless, he obviously holds a sometimes important position. So if you look in the Torah, there's all kinds of positions, right? There's all kinds of positions. There's only one Moshe, and he's sort of unmistakable, right? This is like Mamash, the one that God speaks through, and he's the real heart of the nation. You know, it's an undeniable thing that this is the Rebbe. No matter how disappointed some people might be in that fact, they really can't deny it in their heart. But you have generals, right? You have people who are fighting the Rebbe's battles, and certainly I think Netanyahu is one such person. Like he's literally in command of our forces. So you had David HaMelech had heavy-duty generals, right, who were his men who took us out to battle. It doesn't mean they're the leader of the people, but they hold like a prized and strategic position amongst the rest of the people. But the real head of the Jewish people in the place of Moshe is really is like it says in the Torah. He's like the spiritual commander. Ultimately, he's the commander of the forces. This is just a general. That's how I would explain it. And again, this person has free will. He can either do what the king tells him or not, or at varying different levels, right? Okay. So, for example, the Rebbe told Netanyahu on that fateful Simchas Torah about 30 years ago. You know the story? Netanyahu was like a young, kind of beginning his political career at that time, and the Rebbe invited him in the middle of Simchas Torah, which is the most exciting and popular, crowded day of an insane Hasidic merriment, and he's basically put the whole thing on pause to talk to this guy who was basically nobody of extreme importance at that time. He spent 45 minutes, and all the Hasidim were just waiting to start Simchas Torah, speaking to him on Simchas Torah, 30 years before this event. And what did he tell him? It came out. He told him, don't give away one piece of Eretz Yisrael. This is like you have to fight and die for it. Wow. And unfortunately, in that issue of Gush Katif, I'm not saying, us being put in that position or not, he voted to give it away at that time. He wasn't the prime minister, but he put his vote on it. So in other words, even generals in David's army failed and had to be killed over what they did, and they became traitors. I'm not saying Chas v'Shalom that's what's going on. I'm just saying the fact that you can hold a strong position of power doesn't mean you can't abuse that power, right? But to be the king is a different level. That's like mamish the spark of Yaakov Avinu, where in a certain sense it's a tzaddik and it's a whole other level, etc.
Some of the kings weren't great people either.
the kings could fall, but at that time it could be that the situation was that they weren't necessarily the nasi. In other words, like there was a prophet at that time who was sort of holding the position because the king was in fact some kind of a unfortunate failure of his job. Okay, anyway, there's a lot to unpack there. Weiter. So what we're saying here is that how do we understand the question that it's really ani ladodi after all this arousal? Because it's only arousing you back to yourself, right? That your true nature is to be one, that your essential nature is the king. Ella, 3 lines down from the 4th paragraph at the footnote 27 there, but inside, right? Ella shemikom makom, nonetheless, kasher amelech va'am him berichot makom. So you might say to yourself, if my essential being is nothing other than the Rebbe, why are I not a chassid through and through 24 hours a day, 12 months of the year? Where'd it go? If you're telling me this is the true me. Problem is, when the king is distant from you. In other words, when the king goes away from you, and you sort of forget about it, right? And you could lose sight of your essential nature. It's possible, it doesn't have to be when the king is distanced from you physically, but it could be that when the king is distanced from you, right, your essential connection, and if your essential connection is concealed, then also your will to go and see the king could be concealed. It's behelam. So this is the whole chiddush of Elul. When the king comes to see you, but also in that very place where you are, he reminds you who you are, right? You can forget about it. You could go on your way and get lost in the field, right? What is the field? We said the field is the place where you kind of step down from your city of godliness and you start to get distanced, right? So therefore you forget who you are and you can start getting lost even heading towards the desert. When the king comes to the field, he reminds you what your own true interests are, right? And it suddenly strengthens your hiskashrus. You could falsely believe that he's doing that to you, but the reality is that he's just uncovering who you already are inside. V'al derech zeh, last paragraph on the page. Al derech zehu ba nimshal, and this is how the nimshal works. This is what's going on in the analog. She's orus l'tshuva habai degil yud gimel midas arachim. This arousal, we're now openly calling it arousal for tshuva through these 13 attributes being revealed in the month of Elul, right? Shebe'elul hu sha'ay de'agil yud gimel midas arachim is gal haratzon apinim d'Yisrael. What did we now understand? That in Elul, it arouses the inner will of the Jew, that which is already his, right? It's not something that's happening to you, it's something that's being uncovered within you. It's understood also from the continuation of the Maimer, after the whole mashal is over. If you remember from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer that we learned, what is the next chunk of the Maimer? The Rebbe also helps us understand the flow of the Maimer. Right after the mashal, he goes into this concept of the word Yisrael. Who remembers what we learned from the word Yisrael, from that mimer? Noam.
That the inner will of the Jews is a permanent state of wanting God as king.
I couldn't have said it better myself. The inner will of the Jew is the permanent state of wanting God as king. Now we can understand, which you might not have put that all together when you read the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, but now based on the next thing that happens after the mashal, which is now we understand as a mashal of total arousal, the king in the field is arousing, the first phase is arousing, the second phase, like all this arousal, then what does he come and tell you? You already are there, because you're a Yisrael. The name Kael, which is the infinite God, is already Sar, dominating inside of you with the Yud on front just for extra measure, which means it's happening continuously. Why is he telling you, after he tells you this full arousal that's coming to you from above, that you have this essential desire for God inside of you? Because that's what the arousal is coming there to do. It's coming there to remind you this is already who you are. Binyan Shem Kael, right? So what does it say? The Shem Kael who reishis kol hayud givim midas harachamim. That the name Kael, we said, is the first and therefore the totality of all the 13 attributes of mercy. Makoran v'klalusan. It's their source and their entirety. And the Indian Shem Kel Hu Or Ein Sof Baruch Hu Mamish. We said that the name Kel really represents the Or Ein Sof itself. K'moshe Kasuv Kel Hashem v'Ya'er Lanu. As we see that the word Kel refers to light. The light here is referring to the Or Ein Sof. That Or Ein Sof of the name Kel, which is the 13 attributes of mercy, is specifically a light of God which is beyond the Seder Ishtalshalus, right? Is like an unbounded light. The Or Hu Kamo Etzem. And he explains there that what's so exciting about the fact that it shines, and he explains by way of a fire. In the mimer over there, he says that Hashem Elokecha or Ochlahu, he's a consuming fire. Here's a good test of your memory. What was the significance that we said Hashem was a consuming fire in conjunction with the name Kael? What was the association of that Hashem is a fire with the name Kael? Who remembers? See, you're getting tested inside the class. You weren't here. You're off the hook. Agreed. That's the right answer. Who remembers? What is it? So he says, what is like a fire where you can't really tell where the light starts and the fire ends, right? That the light is really is basically bringing the fire itself outward. And what was that an analogy for? He explains in the brackets in a second. I'll just say it before we get there. Is that there's two ways that Hashem's Or Ein Sof can essentially come down and affect the worlds. One is through a tzimtzum, which is that from this level of Keser, which is the 13 attributes of mercy, it goes through a contraction and then it goes into an Or Panimi called the Chochma, Bina, and Das, and it basically has to take a haircut, right, and hide itself inside of a finite world. Or it's possible that the Or Ein Sof can shine like light from a fire where it is not going through a contraction, but the very essence itself is brought into the lower worlds, and it shines as is from above to below without being contracted. And this is like the notion of why we call it light, because it's the very essence and source itself being projected, not going through some kind of a contraction, and it seems to. That's what the mimer is coming to explain over there. And therefore, if you have the Kael inside of you, what is the Kael? The Kael is the Or Ein Sof. And what did we just say about the Or Ein Sof? It's not something different from the Etzem itself. So the fact that the Kael inside of you means that you have the essence of Hashem inside of you. That is your true nature and your true existence. And he explains in these brackets, basically what I just said, that this is Kamavur Bakam Makomos. It's explained in many places. The Chiluk bein Or LaShefa. What's the difference between Or and Shefa? Right? There are two ways of explaining how one thing comes off of another thing. But the difference is Or is as we said, like fire, it's still connected. It literally, like a beam of light, which is still connected to its source, and it's bringing the source to you. Whereas Shefa is oftentimes considered like, for example, like a waterfall or like a river. That there's Shefa coming from the top to the bottom, but there's a very big difference. The water that comes from the top, when it gets to the bottom, it's not connected to the top anymore. The top of the river is already different water. So there's actually like a disconnect and a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know at the top of my head here, but it's like a disjointing of the actual Shefa from the source, which means there's a tzimtzum and a disconnect. What you wind up getting is not exactly the revelation of the essence itself. It's something that was taken from the essence and brought to a different place, right, through a contraction. So this is the difference between Or and Shefa. That the Or, if you have a possession of the Or, it means you're actually holding the essence itself, not some sort of extension or decompartmentalizing of the essence. Shefa shemashpia mitzamtzem atzmo. Shefa is that the mashpia contracts himself lefi erech hamakabel in order to go into the limitations of the receiver. Right? So since the human brain or the world cannot handle the Or Ein Sof, therefore the Or Ein Sof does us a favor. It doesn't show us the Or Ein Sof. It contracts itself and gives us something else. That's called Shefa. But Or hu me'ein ha'ma'or. Whereas Or it doesn't go through that contraction. It doesn't care about trying to make itself fit into the limitations of the receiver, it gives over the giver as is. And this is called kale, and this is what we have flowing inside of us, which means we have an aspect of divinity inside of us which is not in accordance with the limitations of the human being. It's just like the full revelation of the light from the fire, which is ultimately the fire itself. And that's not only you have that, that is essentially ruling over you and is the real you at any given moment. And therefore, as we've been saying, all the arousal is only there to trigger a realization that you are a Yisrael. And even there's such a line that says, "Afal pi shechata Yisraelu." Even though the person sins, he's still called a Yisrael, because you can't really undo this nature. All you can do is go to a state where you go into the field and you distance yourself from the king. I'm saying when the king's not there, right? And you lose sight of the fact that you're a Yisrael. So the Yisrael can sin, right? Because he forgets his essential nature. The whole idea is when the king comes to the field where you are, it reminds you of who you are and you're automatically back to yourself. In every single person, Meir, Giloi Zeh, right? That's your name, right? So it shines this revelation. Yiser mizo, and what's furthermore, Shagilu d'shem Kale shebechol echad miYisrael. This revelation of Kale inside of every one of us is not only in you, but it is the dominator of you. It is the full you, Sar, Yisrael, Sar, Umoshel Bakirbo, and dominates inside of you. The Yisrael who osios Yud Sar Kale, as he says and concludes over there, that's what the name Yisrael, the Yud, which means continuous, Sar, dominating Kale, the level of Kale inside of you. V'zeu shabitul eloku shebechol echad miYisrael. And that is why, because you are in possession of such a godly entity, not only, it's the wrong wording, not that you're in possession of, but it's in possession of you. It's the real you is something totally beyond the Seder Ishtalshalus, something which is not in fitting with the limitations of man. That is defining your true inner nature. Since that's the case, right? Hu bittul shelamayla mitam v'das. That's why every single Jew has the capability and actually the intrinsic need to nullify themselves to Hashem in a way which is beyond comprehension. In other words, if that should get triggered, your true nature, it will bind to Hashem, even if it totally goes against sense and emotion and everything else. Just like the nature of, let's say, air pocket under the water is going to go up and meet its source. Nothing you can say or do is going to stop it. It's the nature of it to do that, and it will defy anything that stands in its way, including intelligence. Because inside of us is this revelation of God, which is totally beyond anything worldly. It's just that sometimes it can get hidden. And al yidei gilu diyud give me sarachim shbe'elo. So this is the gift Hashem does for us in this month. He comes to us and reminds us who we are. He comes and reveals to us the 13 attributes of mercy in Elul. Which what are the 13 attributes of mercy? They start with the word kale, right? Which is essentially all of them wrapped up in one's name. So he basically comes and brings you a reminder of your source. Which then reveals the kale inside of every one of us. No, it's Hashem, right? So, but the Hashem is basically calling by Yikra Hashem. It's a calling to Hashem. And then when you call to Hashem, what do you say? Keil Rachum V'chanu. V'zeu shavur de'elu hi ani ladodi. Now we can answer our question why we can still call this whole operation an ani ladodi. Av shi sordu siyai de gilu milamayla, even though it's aroused from above. Because the revelation from above is merely a causality which creates a revelation of your true will of the person himself, of the I. Right? What are we holding here? Pretty good. So really, if you think about it, he's completely upended the entire Elul the way we thought about in the last Maimer. Right? We were thinking about this entirely differently. And the Rebbe even taught us how to read the other Maimer, sort of in the Pshat, and then he explained to us that that's not the Pshat at all. I just want to take a second to realize the profound depth of how one could read a Maimer completely wrong Even the Rebbe's showing us that like that would be the normal reading, and then he says, but that reading doesn't make any sense at all. If you go a little bit deeper, you have to completely reread this entire thing. You thought the Ani Ladodi was that you're busy doing this whole thing yourself, right? Revelations come later, as it turns out, the exact opposite of the mashal, right? There's a huge revelation in this month. And the idea that it's an Ani Ladodi is merely that with all this revelation, it's knocking on the door and reminding you of who you really are. That's why we can call it an Ani, because the true Ani, anyway, only wants Hashem.
So you're saying that there's really no work at all. Like you're not doing anything at all. It's all revelations and it's all just Hashem shining it to you. So what's Ani Ladodi is that I'm really showing out my true self. That's what Ani Ladodi is. That's really what I understand from what you just said.
I don't think that that's exactly the read, because no, I mean, then you're really taking away the Ani Ladodi. You're doing it. It's just that what we're saying is that how are you doing this? Because we're pulling out the real you. If it's just a revelation above, you're not doing it, then there really is no Ani Ladodi, right? No. The point is that I'm trying to find you, right? And so therefore, I'm going to make all kinds of attempts, including taking off my crown, coming into the field, and like getting in, making myself available to you, in order so that you can remind yourself of who you really are, right? So when you do remind yourself of who you really are, it's you doing it, right? You are doing it.
But Hashem also, it's Hashem showing you the fear to remind you who you truly are.
Well, that's kind of the difference. The difference is that the king doesn't necessarily. What does he do? He's not doing it for you. He's uncovering you. That's the difference, right? It is still somewhat of an empowerment because he's uncovering you, right? So you do it, right? The point is it's easier to get to yourself, right? And I find this, all of a sudden I see, for example, and you can all see, you guys were here for a year, you notice that the base medrash is just like filled with light and screaming Torah, like more than usual. You notice that there's like people that are coming from the woodworks trying to come and find their way to find a place in the base medrash suddenly in the month of Elul. Where's it coming from? What happened to everybody, right? It's not that the revelation is making them realize what they really want out of their life, right? So it is you doing it ultimately. The point is this is a clarifying to get to your true inner nature.
Saying it's compared to Rosh Hashanah, which is
Compared to Rosh Hashanah, which is the difference is that over there we have this lashon that the Ma'or comes close to the Nitzotz. That they're really it's more than just the king sort of presenting himself, right? Because in the mashal you still have to go see the king. That's the difference, right? Whereas there's this concept that there's this overwhelming, again, who gets the revelation? Someone who came to see the king in the field. But if you do come to see the king in the field, something else happens to you where you are swept away and you're empowered in some kind of a new way that you didn't have these kochos that you had before. It's just like we talk about Rosh Hashanah is the idea of waking up from sleep, right? That man was put to sleep on the sixth day, and then he woke up, and this is the concept of Rosh Hashanah. Also, all the light of creation leaves the world in Erev Rosh Hashanah, and then you wake up. When you wake up, you're infused with new kochos you didn't have before. So the idea that all of a sudden you're on Rosh Hashanah, all the work that you did puts you in new stead with all kinds of new kochos from the Ein Sof that you didn't even realize you had inside of you before. That's kind of what it means that you're delivered a package that you have to unpack the whole year of things that are given to you from above. But the essential desire for Hashem, you already have, and that's what the king is inspiring you to find, so that you go and become one of his men to get that greater gift even on Rosh Hashanah.
So El's like really unpacking. So El's just like uncloaking and uncovering who you truly are. Rosh Hashanah is Hashem is giving you a major gift from above.
Exactly. All right, I want to hold here because we're going to get into a whole other topic, and it's too hard to